Hey, son, close your eyes for just a moment. Picture a kitchen in the early 1960s. The window above the sink is cracked open just enough to let in the smell of cut grass and warm concrete. Something is bubbling quietly on the stove. A dish towel is folded over the oven handle, and your mother is standing there like she has all the answers, because in that kitchen, she did. If you enjoy this kind of storytelling, go ahead and hit like. Leave a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from, and subscribe if you want more. We are also now live on Spotify, so if you prefer to listen while you are doing something else, the link is down in the description. We would love to have you there. Now, before we begin, let me ask you a few things. What did a Monday morning actually smell like in 1963? What did your grandmother reach for before she even thought about a recipe? What happened to the bread that went stale on Wednesday? Why did the chicken come out better when it sat overnight in something your mother mixed together in a bowl without measuring a single thing? What did it feel like to walk into a kitchen where something had been slow cooking all afternoon, the smell meeting you at the front door before you even got your coat off? What did families do with leftover bacon grease? Where did they keep it? And who taught them that? It is 1962 now. The percolator's going. Someone down the street is pulling a pan out of the oven. The screen door is about to swing open, and everything that happened in that kitchen is about to come back. Every kitchen in the early 1960s kept a can near the stove, and if you knew what it was for, you never had to wonder why everything tasted better back then. It was usually a coffee tin, sometimes an old soup can with a strainer lid made of cheesecloth or a piece of wire mesh, sitting in the same spot day after day, warm from the burner beside it, dark and glossy inside, with rendered fat that smelled faintly of smoke and salt even when nothing was cooking. You did not buy that fat, you saved it. Every morning when the bacon came out of the pan, your mother tipped the skillet carefully over the can and let the grease run through the strainer in a slow amber pour, catching the crumbs and the burnt bits, keeping what was clean and useful. It made a soft sound when it hit the layer already in the tin, a quiet, settling sound, like something being put away properly. By the end of the week, that can was half full, and it was one of the most valuable things on that stove. Bacon grease went into the cornbread batter. It went into the cast iron skillet before the eggs. It went into the pan when you were wilting greens. A spoonful dropped in before the collards or the spinach hit the heat, giving everything that faint smokiness that no bottle of oil has ever quite matched. It went into the biscuit dough when the shortening ran low. It went onto the surface of the skillet before the pancakes, giving the edges that lacy, slightly crispy border that people still talk about when they describe the pancakes their grandmother made. The can sat in the same place always, back left corner of the stove, or on the little shelf above it, or sometimes on the windowsill if the kitchen was small and the stove had no back rail. You knew where it was without looking. Your hand went to it the way your hand goes to a light switch in a dark room you have lived in long enough. It was not a decision. It was a reflex built out of years of the same morning, the same pan, the same quiet pour. There is something worth sitting with in that image. A tin can doing the work of what we now pay a great deal of money to approximate. Specialty cooking fats, smoked finishing oils, rendered lard sold in small jars at prices that would have seemed absurd in 1962. The bacon grease can cost nothing. It was a byproduct of breakfast, collected without ceremony, used without fuss, and it produced results that were honest and deep and impossible to replicate with anything cleaner or more expensive. The practice faded gradually as the decades moved on. Health concerns changed how people thought about animal fat. Cooking sprays arrived. Vegetable oil became the default. The coffee tins were replaced by nonstick pans that did not need priming. And something quiet went out of the kitchen when that happened. Something that was not just about flavor, but about the rhythm of a kitchen that wasted nothing and understood that what was left behind in the pan after a good meal was not a mess to be discarded, but an ingredient waiting for its next use. If you grew up in a kitchen that kept that can, you remember it without being asked. The particular smell of it, the way the lid sat slightly tilted, the color of the grease in different seasons, darker in winter when there was more frying, lighter in summer when breakfasts were quicker and cooler. That can was the kitchen's memory. Every meal left a little of itself behind, and the next meal was better for it. Let's start with the night before, because that is where half the cooking in a 1960s kitchen actually began. There were no canned beans on the counter, or if there were, they were set aside for emergencies. The real beans were the dried ones kept in a glass jar on the pantry shelf. White navy beans or pintos or Great Northerns, pale and dusty and quiet, waiting to be woken up by nothing more complicated than a bowl of cold water and a little time. The process started simply. You measured the beans into a colander and rinsed them under the tap, picking out anything that did not look right. A shriveled one, a small stone that had made it through the sorting at the plant, the occasional bean that had gone slightly dark. Then the beans went into the biggest bowl in the cabinet, the one with the wide rim that your mother used for everything from mixing biscuits to soaking fruit, and cold water went over them until they were covered by at least 2 inches. That bowl went to the back of the counter or onto the lower shelf of the refrigerator if the kitchen was warm, and it stayed there until morning. By morning, the beans had doubled. They were swollen and smooth, their skins stretched tight, the water around them slightly cloudy and faintly sweet from the starch that had released overnight. That water got poured off and the beans were rinsed again, cold and clean in the colander, and then they were ready for whatever the pot called for. Navy beans, for the slow pot of soup that would cook all morning. Pintos, for the pot that would go with cornbread at dinner. Great Northerns for the cassoulet adjacent dish that your mother did not call cassoulet, because that was not a word that appeared in her kitchen vocabulary, but that tasted like exactly that. The soaking did several things at once. It shortened the cooking time considerably, which mattered when the stove had other work to do. It made the beans cook more evenly, the centers becoming tender at the same moment the outside softened, rather than the outside going mushy, while the inside stayed grainy. And it reduced the compounds in the beans that caused digestive discomfort, a practical benefit that home cooks understood long before anyone put a scientific explanation to it. Some cooks added a pinch of baking soda to the soaking water, an old trick that softened the skins faster and cut a little more time off the eventual cook. Others added nothing at all and let the water do its work on its own. Either way, the patience was the point. The beans needed the night. You could not rush them and get the same result. And in a 1960s kitchen that understood the relationship between time and flavor, that was not considered an inconvenience. It was just how it was done. What is striking now is how completely that rhythm has been replaced. Canned beans are convenient and perfectly adequate, and nobody should feel guilty for using them. But there is something specific that gets lost in the exchange. The overnight bowl on the counter was a kind of planning, a quiet commitment to tomorrow's dinner made the evening before. You could see it sitting there in the morning when you came into the kitchen, and it told you something about the shape of the day ahead. Soup for lunch, beans at dinner. The day already had a structure before it started, built around nothing more than a bowl of cold water and something small and dried that was in the process of becoming something warm and whole. It is the middle of the week now, and the bread that was soft on Sunday has gone tight and dry at the edges. the crust pulling away from the center the way it does when the air has been at it for a few days. In 1960, that loaf was not thrown away. Nobody reached for a fresh one, and nobody thought twice about what to do. Your mother dampened a clean dish towel under the tap, wrung it out until it was barely moist, wrapped the loaf in it, and slid the whole thing into a low oven. The oven was set somewhere around 300 degrees, not hot enough to bake anything further, just warm enough to coax the moisture back into the crumb slowly and evenly. The damp cloth created a small environment around the bread, a pocket of steam inside the fabric, and as the heat built up gently, that steam moved into the loaf from the outside in. It took about 15 minutes, sometimes 20, for a larger loaf. When the cloth came off, the bread was warm again and soft at the center, the crust restored to something close to what it had been on the first day. This worked because bread does not actually go stale by losing moisture. It goes stale through a process called retrogradation, where the starch molecules realign into a firmer structure over time. Heat interrupts that process and partially reverses it, which is why warm bread always tastes fresher than cold bread, even when it is the same age. The damp cloth simply ensured that the heat reached the interior of the loaf without drying out the crust further before the inside had a chance to soften. Your mother did not know the word retrogradation. She knew that a damp cloth and a warm oven brought the bread back, and that was enough. The knowledge passed down through kitchens was practical in exactly this way, stripped of explanation and carried entirely in the hands, and the result. You watched it done. You did it yourself, and eventually you did it without thinking, the way you do anything that has been correct long enough to become automatic. There is a version of this that most people have encountered in a restaurant, the bread basket that arrives at the table warm and slightly steamed, soft all the way through. That warmth is doing the same thing. The bread in that basket is not always fresh from that morning. It has often been revived by exactly this principle, heat and moisture applied gently, the stale undone just enough to make the loaf feel new again. What strikes you about this trick now is how little it asks of you. No new ingredients, no equipment beyond a clean cloth and a functioning oven, no waste. The loaf that might have been sliced into breadcrumbs or fed to the birds on a Wednesday was instead brought back to the table, and nobody at dinner would have known the difference. That particular kind of economy was not considered thrift in any self-conscious way. It was simply the normal relationship between a household and its food. Nothing left until it had given everything it had, and even then, someone would find one more use for it. The bread came out of the oven wrapped in its cloth. Your mother peeling back the fabric carefully at the edges to let the steam escape before she set it on the cutting board. The smell it gave off in that moment was something between fresh bread and warm laundry, clean and good and deeply domestic. It was the smell of a kitchen that knew what it was doing with what it had. There is a small pot of water sitting on the back burner after the potatoes came out for dinner, cloudy and pale and starchy. And in most kitchens today, that water goes straight down the drain without a second thought. In a 1960s kitchen, it did not. That water, still warm, faintly sweet from the starch, was set aside in a jar or a bowl on the counter, because bread day was coming, and your mother knew something that very few people talk about anymore. Potato water fed the yeast. That is the simple version of what it did. Yeast is a living thing that needs sugar to activate and carbon dioxide to produce the air pockets that make bread light, and the starch dissolved in the water from boiled potatoes breaks down into simple sugars that yeast can access more readily than the sugars in plain flour and water alone. The result was a dough that rose faster, rose higher, and produced a loaf with a finer crumb and a softer interior that held its texture longer than a loaf made with plain water. You would not have found this explained in a recipe. Most recipes from that era simply said warm water. But in kitchens where potato water was the standard, the bread was noticeably better. And the cooks who made it knew why in the way home cooks often know why. Not through chemistry, but through comparison. The loaf made on the day after potatoes was the best loaf of the week. It had a particular tenderness to it, a slight richness, a crust that was golden without being, brittle, and a smell coming out of the oven that was several degrees warmer and sweeter than bread made any other way. The potato water had to be cooled before it went near the yeast. Too hot, and it would kill the yeast before it had a chance to do anything, leaving the dough flat and dense and beyond rescue. The right temperature was warm against the inside of your wrist, the same test used for a baby's bottle, a comparison that made complete sense in a household where both things were happening at approximately the same time of day. You poured the water into the bowl, crumbled or sprinkled the yeast over the surface, and waited for the bloom, that soft foam that rose in the first few minutes and told you the yeast was alive and working. Then the flour went in gradually, the dough coming together under your hands, pulling away from the sides of the bowl, becoming something dense and elastic and alive feeling in a way that is difficult to describe to someone who has only ever bought bread from a shelf. Bread dough has a particular warmth to it, from the yeast working inside it, and when you have been kneading it for 10 minutes and your hands are dusted with flour and the kitchen smells like something ancient and good, the potato water that started the whole thing is long forgotten. But it is in there, doing its quiet work. The loaf that came out of that oven on bread day was something the whole house oriented itself around. The smell reached every room. People found reasons to come into the kitchen. The first slice, cut while the bread was still too warm to slice cleanly, was eaten standing at the counter with butter that melted immediately into the crumb, and it was as good as anything that kitchen ever produced. Simple and elemental, and made better by a pot of cloudy water that another kitchen would have poured away without a second thought. The ground beef came home from the butcher wrapped in white paper and tied with string, and it was not cheap, not in the way people sometimes remember it being. A pound had to feed 4 people and sometimes 5, and the way you made that happen was not by buying more, but by knowing what to mix in. In 1961, the meatloaf that came out of a modest kitchen on a Tuesday evening was often more oats or breadcrumbs than beef, and nobody at the table could tell the difference. The oats were the old-fashioned kind, rolled and thick, the ones that took several minutes on the stove rather than the quick variety that came in the individual packets. They went into the mixing bowl with the raw beef, along with an egg to bind everything together, a spoonful of Worcestershire sauce, a little salt and pepper, perhaps some grated onion, or a handful of dried parsley from the tin on the spice shelf. Everything was mixed by hand, bare hands working the ingredients together until the whole thing was one uniform mass. The oats distributed evenly through the beef, invisible once cooked and detectable only as a certain softness in the finished loaf. Breadcrumbs worked differently. Fine dried crumbs absorbed the fat as the loaf cooked, keeping the interior moist and preventing the shrinkage that could leave a meatloaf dry and tight by the time it reached the table. Fresh breadcrumbs made by grating stale bread on the box grater held even more moisture than the dried kind and gave the finished loaf a texture that was almost delicate, tender at the center, slightly crusted on the outside, from the glaze of ketchup that went on top in the last 15 minutes. That glaze caramelized in the oven heat and turned dark and sticky and sweet, and it was the smell of it catching and deepening in the final minutes that told you dinner was close. This practice of stretching meat was not apologetic. It was not something cooks did quietly and hoped no one would notice. It was simply good kitchen management. The kind of intelligence that came from running a household on a careful budget and finding that the results were often better than a pure beef version would have been. The oats added a slight earthiness. The breadcrumbs added tenderness. The egg held everything together with a richness that made the finished dish feel more substantial than its ingredients strictly suggested it should. The same principle went into meatballs, into hamburger patties when the package was small and the family was hungry, into stuffed peppers where the filling had to stretch across 4 or 6 halves and still feel generous. A little rice, a little bulgur, a little finely chopped mushroom that disappeared entirely into the mixture, but contributed a depth of flavor that straight beef could not produce on its own. These were not substitutes for the real thing. They were part of what the real thing was, in a kitchen that understood that flavor came from balance and technique and patience, not from the amount of money that went into the pan. What gets lost when ingredients are no longer a constraint is sometimes the ingenuity that grew directly from that constraint. The meatloaf your grandmother made was better than most meatloaf you can order in a restaurant, and part of the reason was that she had thought carefully about every ingredient in it, not because she had the luxury of thinking, but because she did not have the luxury of being careless. Let's talk about the tougher cuts. The ones that sat lower in the butcher's case, with a slightly darker color and a firmer grain, the ones a family on a careful budget reached for more often than not. Chuck roast, round steak, chicken pieces that had been working hard. In the early 1960s, those cuts were not a limitation. They were a starting point, and what you did with them the night before was the whole secret. Vinegar was one answer. Not a great deal of it, and not applied directly. It went into a marinade, a mixture of acid and oil and whatever seasonings the dish called for. And the meat went into that mixture overnight, covered in the refrigerator, turning once before bed and once in the morning, if you remembered. The acid in the vinegar worked on the muscle fibers slowly, breaking down the proteins that made tough cuts resistant to a knife, softening them from the outside in over the course of several hours. By morning, the surface of the meat had changed, slightly darker where it had been in contact with the marinade, more yielding when you pressed it with a finger. Buttermilk was the other answer, and in some ways the gentler one. A chicken soaked overnight in buttermilk came out of the refrigerator with a surface that was almost silky, the proteins partially broken down by the mild acidity of the dairy, the meat itself more tender all the way to the bone. When that chicken went into a hot pan of oil, the buttermilk that clung to the surface crisped into something extraordinary, a coating that was not exactly a batter and not exactly a crust, but something between the two, deeply flavored and golden and with a texture that held up through the whole meal. The important thing in either case was time. You could not rush the chemistry. A 2-hour soak produced a modest improvement. An overnight soak produced a different piece of meat entirely, something that behaved in the pan the way more expensive cuts behaved, yielding to the heat rather than fighting it, releasing its fat slowly, staying moist even when the cooking went a few minutes long. The patience built into the process was inseparable from the result. The cook who started dinner the night before was not being elaborate. She was being efficient in a way that required no extra effort on cooking day, because all the effort had already been done. There is a reason that most fried chicken recipes worth their reputation involve an overnight buttermilk soak. Not because the recipe was invented that way as a stylistic choice, but because the generations of cooks who developed those recipes understood what the soak was doing and kept it, because removing it meant producing something lesser. The technique survived because it worked, plainly and reliably, across every variation of every kitchen that used it. Round steak treated with a red wine vinegar marinade and then braised low and slow for 2 hours was not a compromise. It was dinner, and it was a good dinner, and the people who ate it were not thinking about what it had cost, or what cut it came from. They were thinking that the meat was tender and the gravy was rich, and the biscuits your mother had put on the table alongside it were catching every drop of what was in the pan. That is what a good marinade made possible. Not just tender meat, but a meal that felt generous even when the starting ingredients had asked for a little help. It is Sunday afternoon, and the roast has just come out of the oven. The pan sitting on top of the stove is dark at the edges, crusted with drippings that have caramelized against the iron, and the smell coming off it is the kind of smell that fills the whole house and makes everyone drift toward the kitchen without meaning to. What happens next takes about 4 minutes and requires nothing more than flour, the fat already in the pan, and whatever liquid is nearby. Your mother tips the pan slightly and looks at the fat that is pooled at one end. She decides how much to keep and ladles off the excess into a waiting bowl, leaving behind what she needs, maybe 3 or 4 tablespoons, enough to absorb the flour that is coming. The flour goes in from a spoon, stirred into the hot fat immediately over medium heat, and the smell shifts the moment it hits the pan, going from pure animal fat to something toasted and deeper, the beginning of what will become the gravy. This is the roux, though again, that word may not have been used in that kitchen. It was simply the step you did before the liquid went in. The liquid came from wherever made sense. The water the vegetables had cooked in. A cup of broth kept warm in a small pot on the back burner. Sometimes a splash of red wine if there was an open bottle, and in many kitchens there was always an open bottle kept near the stove for exactly this purpose. The liquid went in gradually, a little at a time, the whisk moving constantly to work out the lumps before more was added. The pan released its crusted drippings into the liquid as the heat built, those dark patches lifting off the bottom of the pan and dissolving into the gravy, carrying with them everything the meat had left behind in 2 hours of slow roasting. The pan drippings were the whole point. That concentrated reduction of fat and protein and sugars and the particular flavor of that specific roast on that specific Sunday was something that could not be made from a packet or a cube or a jar of pre-made gravy, no matter how good the jar. It was the byproduct of a long cook translated into something pourable, a sauce made not from a recipe, but from the record of what had happened in that pan all afternoon. When the gravy was right, it coated the back of a spoon and held its shape for a moment before falling. Your mother tasted it from a small spoon, adjusted the salt, perhaps added a pinch of pepper or a scrape of nutmeg if that was her habit, and then poured it into the gravy boat that came out only on Sundays. The gravy boat was white with a small rim of blue flowers and a matching ladle that was always slightly too small for the job, and it sat at the head of the table near the roast, and every person at that table reached for it at least twice. No packet was ever going to produce that. No powder dissolved in hot water was going to carry the flavor of a specific afternoon's cooking in a specific family's kitchen. The pan gravy was the meal's own sauce, made from what the meal had given back, and there was a completeness to that which is genuinely worth mourning now that it has become uncommon. Most gravies today begin from outside the pan. The best ones never did. Monday's soup started on Friday, and not in any formal way. It started the moment your mother looked at what was left of the weekend roast, separated the meat from the bone with 2 forks, wrapped the bone in paper, and set it in the coldest part of the refrigerator. That bone was not a leftover. It was an ingredient, and it had a job to do before the week was out. By Monday morning, it came out of the refrigerator and went into the largest pot in the kitchen, covered with cold water, set over a medium flame that was brought up slowly to just below a boil. The slow heat was important. A hard boil produced a cloudy, slightly bitter stock. A slow, gentle simmer, with the surface kept at that particular barely moving state that French cooks call a smile. produced something clear and golden and deeply flavored, the gelatin and the minerals, and the marrow releasing gradually into the water over the course of several hours. While the bone simmered, the kitchen filled with a smell that was both rich and clean, the smell of something good being made from almost nothing. An onion went into the pot, halved and unpeeled because the papery skin added color. A few peppercorns. A bay leaf from the tin that lived on the second shelf of the spice cabinet. The heel of a celery bunch that would otherwise have gone into the compost. Whatever vegetables were at the edge of their usefulness, a carrot that was still good, but slightly soft. A parsnip that had been in the vegetable drawer since last week. A handful of parsley stems left over from the bunch that had been used for something else. None of this was measured. None of it followed a written recipe. It followed the logic of the refrigerator, which is to say it used what was there and what needed to be used. And the result was a broth that tasted different every week because the kitchen was different every week, shaped by what had been cooked the weekend before and what was left over from the days between. The variability was not inconsistency. It was flavor, built from the accumulated decisions of a household that wasted very little. After several hours, the pot was strained through the colander, lined with cheesecloth, the bone and the spent vegetables pressed gently to release the last of their liquid, and what came through was the weak soup base. It went into a clean pot, was skimmed of fat from the surface, and was divided between whatever was being made that day and the jar that would go back into the refrigerator for the next use. It set overnight into a soft gel, a sign that the collagen from the bone had done its work. And when it was melted back down into soup the following day, the body and richness of it were unmistakable. This is what people mean when they say food was better then. And what they are actually remembering is not some superior ingredient or some lost technique that cannot be replicated. They are remembering the flavor of a broth made over several hours from a bone that had already done one job and was doing another. They are remembering what patience tastes like when you make it liquid and put it in a bowl on a cold Monday afternoon. It is not a complicated flavor. It is just a true one. Salad in a 1960s kitchen did not come in a plastic bag with a zip closure. It came as a head of iceberg lettuce, firm and dense and cool when you pressed it, bought at the start of the week and expected to last. Whether it lasted depended almost entirely on how you stored it, and the women who kept beautiful salads all week long had a small trick that took about 30 seconds and made all the difference. The trick was paper. A single sheet of paper towel, or in earlier kitchens a piece of clean newsprint, or a page torn from a brown paper bag, wrapped loosely around the head of lettuce before it went into the refrigerator. The paper absorbed the excess moisture that naturally condensed around the lettuce in the cold, keeping the outer leaves from going slimy while maintaining enough humidity around the head to prevent it from drying out. It sounds simple because it is simple, but the result was a head of lettuce that was still crisp and fresh on Friday from a Monday purchase, the inner leaves bright and cold, the outer ones still holding their structure. Before the refrigerator, the icebox performed the same function in a slightly less controlled way. The icebox kept things cold, but not perfectly dry, and the same principle applied. Wrapping the lettuce in something absorbent, placing it in the coldest part of the box, away from the drain where moisture pooled, gave it the best possible chance of lasting through the week. Housewives in the 1940s and early 50s had already developed this habit before the electric refrigerator became standard, and they carried it forward into the newer appliance without questioning whether it was still necessary, because it was still necessary. The outer leaves, if they had wilted slightly despite the paper, were peeled away and not discarded. They went into the pot for soup, or onto the cutting board to be shredded fine for a salad, where texture mattered less than flavor. The inner core of the head was the prize, kept tight and pale and cold, For the evening salad that went out in the wooden bowl, tossed simply with oil and vinegar and a pinch of salt and perhaps a shake of celery salt from the little tin on the spice shelf. That salad bowl was a specific object in many kitchens of that era. Dark wood, deeply stained from years of oil, with 2 large wooden spoons for tossing that were never washed with soap, because the oil that had soaked into them was part of the seasoning. You are not supposed to wash the bowl itself with soap either. Just rinse it in cold water and wipe it dry, leaving the accumulated oil from 100 dressings to give the next salad a depth of flavor that a clean bowl could not provide. The lettuce from the paper-wrapped head, cold and crisp, torn into pieces in that bowl, was something different from the bagged lettuce that replaced it. Not because the lettuce was inherently better, but because it had been cared for in the right way from the moment it came into the kitchen. The care was the thing. Not elaborate care, not expensive care. Just attentive care, the kind that noticed what a vegetable needed and provided it without making anything of it. The way you open a window when the kitchen gets warm or turn the bread halfway through the bake. Small attentions that added up across the week into a refrigerator that worked harder and wasted less and sent something worth eating to the table 5 nights out of 7. There was usually one pan in the kitchen that never went into the cabinet because it was always in use, or sitting on the back of the stove cooling down from the last thing it cooked. Cast iron, black and seasoned and heavy, the kind of pan that had been in the family long enough that nobody remembered exactly where it came from. In the early 1960s, that skillet was not a specialty item. It was the kitchen. It fried the morning eggs in the fat left from the bacon that had cooked in it 5 minutes before. It seared the pork chops on high heat before they went into the oven to finish. It made the cornbread that went alongside the beans, the batter poured into a pan that had been heating in the oven first, so the bottom of the bread hit a surface already hot enough to begin forming a crust the moment it made contact. That crust, the particular crackling dark bottom of a cornbread baked in a properly heated cast iron pan, is one of the specific textures of that era's cooking that no other pan has ever reproduced. The seasoning on a cast iron pan was a kind of history. Each use added to it. The fat from 1,000 pieces of bacon, the drippings from 100 roast chickens, the oil from all those fried eggs had polymerized into the surface of the pan over years of use, creating a coating that was naturally nonstick and deeply flavored and completely unlike anything that came out of a factory. A new cast iron pan was gray and raw and slightly rough to the touch. An old one, well kept and properly used, was black all the way through and smooth enough to slide an egg across with nothing more than a low flame and a small knob of butter. You did not wash it with soap. Soap stripped the seasoning, undid the years of work, left the surface raw and vulnerable to rust. You wiped it out with a cloth or a paper towel while it was still warm, scraped away anything that had stuck with a wooden spatula, and dried it on the burner for a minute to make sure no moisture remained. Then a very thin layer of fat, whatever was in the bacon grease can, rubbed into the surface with a folded cloth before it went back on the stove. This took perhaps 90 seconds and kept the pan in the condition it needed to be in for the next use, which was often the following morning. The weight of a cast iron pan was part of its character. You knew it in your hand the way you know a good hammer or a well-worn pair of scissors. It asked something of you physically. It required both hands to move it across the stove. It could not be tossed or flipped the way a thin aluminum pan could. It demanded attention and a certain deliberateness, and in return, it held heat in a way that nothing else did, radiating warmth long after the burner was off, finishing the cooking in the pan's own stored heat rather than from the flame below. That cornbread, specifically that. Batter made from stone-ground cornmeal and buttermilk, and a single egg and a little bacon grease stirred in for richness, poured into the screaming hot skillet and put into a 400-degree oven for 20 minutes. The sound it made when the batter hit the pan, that immediate aggressive sizzle, was the sound of the crust beginning. And what came out of the oven 20 minutes later had a bottom that was nearly black, and a top that was golden, and an interior that was dense and slightly sweet, and tasted like the pan it had been cooked in. Which is to say, it tasted like everything that had been cooked in that pan before it. A faint richness and depth that a baking dish could not have produced in 100 years of trying. Your mother is standing at the stove stirring something that smells like sugar and butter and warm cream. And she is not looking at a thermometer because there is no thermometer. There is a glass of cold water sitting on the counter, beside the pot, and that glass is all she needs. This was the way candy had been made for generations before anyone sold a clip-on thermometer at the 5 and dime. And in the 1960s, it was still the standard in most home kitchens. The test worked like this. Every few minutes, while the sugar mixture bubbled and thickened in the pan, your mother took a small spoon and dropped a single drop of the hot syrup into the glass of cold water. She watched what happened next, and what happened told her exactly where the candy was in its journey from raw sugar to finished confection. A drop that dissolved immediately and left nothing behind meant the syrup was still too thin, still just sweetened liquid with nowhere near enough concentration to set into anything. A drop that formed a soft ball at the bottom of the glass, one you could pick up between your fingers and press and feel give way, like a very soft caramel, told her she was in the softball stage, right for fudge and certain fondants. A ball that held its shape but still bent when pressed was the firm ball stage. One that held completely and resisted pressure was hard ball. A drop that shattered like glass when it hit the cold water and snapped when you tried to bend. It was hard crack, and that was where brittles and lollipops lived. Each stage had a name, and each name had a feel. And your mother knew those feels in her fingers from years of standing at this same stove, doing this same test. She did not need a number. She needed a drop of syrup and a glass of cold water and the knowledge that lived in her hands. The test took perhaps 5 seconds each time and cost nothing and was as reliable as any thermometer if you knew what you were looking for. The candy that came out of that process was specific to the person making it. Fudge that was soft and yielding from a softball stage pulled a few degrees early. Toffee that was brittle and clean breaking from a syrup taken all the way to hard crack. Caramel sauce that was thick and pourable and smelled of scorched butter, made by someone who knew exactly when to pull the pan from the heat by the color of the sugar alone. That deep amber that appeared in the space of about 30 seconds and went from perfect to burnt if you looked away. The glass of cold water sat on the counter throughout the process, changed out once or twice when the accumulated drops of syrup made it too cloudy to see clearly. The fresh cold water going in from the tap, the glass wiped and replaced beside the stove. It was a companion to the process rather than an interruption of it. You did not stop stirring to test. You stirred with one hand and dipped with the other, the rhythm of it unbroken. The pot never left without attention, for the seconds it took to read the drop. There is something deeply satisfying about a technique that requires nothing more than water and observation. No equipment to calibrate, no battery to replace, no digital display to misread. Just the behavior of a drop of sugar syrup in cold water, which has been telling cooks the same true information for as long as people have been cooking sugar over heat. The children who stood on chairs beside that stove and watched the test performed were learning something that would stay with them longer than most things learned in school. A piece of practical knowledge carried in the body rather than the mind, surfacing whenever a pot of sugar went on the stove and someone thought to ask how close it was. Nothing in a 1960s kitchen went to waste before its time, and that included the outside of things. The peel of an orange or a lemon sitting in the fruit bowl had a job to do before the fruit inside it was cut open. Your mother knew this without thinking about it. Before the orange was sectioned for breakfast or the lemon was squeezed into the pitcher, the outer skin came off in long, careful strips, or was rubbed against the fine side of the grater, and what fell into the bowl below smelled like something that could lift the flavor of a cake, or a glaze, or a pot of cranberries by several degrees. The essential oils in citrus peel are concentrated in the thin colored layer at the very surface, above the white pith that turns bitter the moment your knife goes too deep. Those oils carry the true flavor of the fruit, sharper and more intense than the juice, with a brightness that survives baking temperatures and long cooking times in a way that juice alone does not. A cake, made with both lemon juice and lemon zest, tastes more like lemon than a cake made with juice alone, not because there is more lemon in it by volume, but because the peel contributes a quality of flavor that the liquid cannot provide. Your mother understood this outcome without understanding the chemistry behind it, and so the zest came off first, always before the fruit was opened. The grater that did this work was the box grater kept in the second drawer, the same one that shredded cheese and grated onion and reduced stale bread to fine crumbs. The smallest holes on one face were for zest, and after a few passes of the fruit across those holes, the colored dust that accumulated had a smell so vivid it seemed almost visible. You could close your eyes and know immediately what fruit had been in that hand. Orange was warm and slightly floral. Lemon was sharp and clean. Lime, when lime appeared in that kitchen, was something more complex, slightly bitter at the edges, tropical in a way that felt slightly foreign and therefore special. The zest went directly into whatever it was needed for, or it went onto a small piece of wax paper on the counter to dry if it was not needed immediately. Dried zest kept its flavor reasonably well for a week or two, stored in the small lidded jar that lived on the spice shelf between the dried parsley and the celery salt. It was not as vivid as fresh, but it was far better than nothing, and it was free, which mattered in a kitchen that accounted for everything. The white pith left behind after zesting was not entirely useless either. Boiled in sugar syrup, it produced a candied peel that went on to cookies or into fruitcakes, or was eaten plain from the jar as something between a sweet and a confection. This required more time and more sugar and was not an everyday project, but in a kitchen that approached every ingredient as something with multiple uses, the leap from fresh zest to candied peel was a natural one. Just another extension of the same instinct that kept the bacon grease can on the back of the stove and the soup bone in the refrigerator. What strikes you about this habit now is how little it asks and how much it returns. The difference between a lemon cake with zest and one without is large enough that any person who has tasted both would not choose the lesser version twice. The zest costs nothing. The fruit was already there. The grater was already in the drawer. The only thing required was the habit of reaching for the grater before the knife, a small reordering of the sequence that changed the outcome entirely. There was always a moment mid-recipe when someone reached into the pantry for the brown sugar and found it had gone rock hard, a solid brick that resisted the spoon and crumbled wrong. In a modern kitchen, that might mean a quick internet search for solutions. In a 1960s kitchen, it meant reaching for the bread box. One slice of white bread laid on top of the sugar in its container, the lid pressed back down, and by morning the sugar had softened back to the loose, damp, molasses-smelling texture it was supposed to have. Brown sugar goes hard because it loses moisture. The molasses that coats each grain of sugar is hygroscopic, meaning it naturally attracts and holds water. But in a dry environment or a container that is not perfectly sealed, that moisture escapes over time, and the sugar crystals clump together into a mass that requires a hammer to break apart. The slice of bread in the container releases its own moisture slowly into the enclosed space, and the sugar absorbs it, the molasses softening back to the consistency it had when the bag was first opened. The bread that went in hardened as the sugar softened, trading its moisture for the sugar's rigidity over the course of a night. By morning, the bread was stiff and slightly sweet-smelling, and the sugar was scoopable again, and the bread was not wasted because it could be crumbled onto oatmeal or used as a sweet breadcrumb in a recipe where its slight sugar flavor was an advantage rather than a problem. This same principle worked with a piece of apple, a marshmallow, or a damp paper towel placed in the container, all of them releasing moisture into the sealed space and allowing the sugar to reabsorb it. But bread was what was always on hand, and bread worked as well as anything else. So bread was what most kitchens used. It was not a trick anyone had read about in a magazine. It was the kind of knowledge passed from one kitchen to the next by word of mouth, one cook telling another what worked, the explanation traveling ahead of the understanding of why it worked by a generation or two. The brown sugar container itself was worth noticing. In many kitchens, it was not the original paper bag, but a wide-mouthed glass jar or a small ceramic crock with a fitted lid. Something that sealed better than paper and could be wiped clean and used indefinitely. The sugar inside smelled strongly of molasses, dark and slightly caramel, and pressing your fingers into a fresh container of brown sugar had a specific texture, moist and compressible, and faintly sticky, that was itself pleasurable in the way that certain kitchen sensations are pleasurable before a single thing has been cooked. The bread trick was one of dozens of small solutions in that kitchen that asked nothing of you except the willingness to remember it and apply it at the right moment. No special tools, no trip to the store, just an understanding of what the problem was and what the kitchen already contained that could address it. That kind of resourceful intelligence was not celebrated or written about. It was simply practiced day after day in kitchens where the ingredients available were finite and the meals expected were not. This is one of those small steps that separated a cake that came out clean and whole from one that tore at the edges and stuck to the pan. And it happened before the batter was mixed, before the oven was turned on, sometimes before anything else in the kitchen was touched. Your mother greased the pan with a thin coat of shortening, spread across every surface with a paper wrapper or a folded piece of wax paper, and then she shook flour through it the way a person might dust a countertop, tapping the pan so the flour moved into every corner. The shortening went on first, and it went on thoroughly, into the corners where the sides met the bottom, up the sides to the rim, into every curve and seam of the pan. Crisco was the standard in most kitchens of that era, white and solid and neutral tasting, kept in the can with the red and blue lid on the pantry shelf. A small amount on a folded piece of wax paper, rubbed in a thin even layer across every surface, gave the flour something to adhere to and created the first barrier between the batter and the metal. The flour went in next. A small spoonful dropped into the greased pan. The pan tilted and tapped so the flour rolled around the interior and coated every surface that had been greased. The excess tapped out over the sink or over the mixing bowl if it was the same flour going into the batter. What remained was a thin white coating, barely visible, that would transform during baking into a paper-thin layer between the finished cake and the pan, allowing the cake to release cleanly when the pan was inverted. Some bakers went further and cut a circle of wax paper to fit the bottom of the pan, greasing and flouring the paper as well, creating a double barrier at the most likely point of sticking. This was considered extra insurance rather than standard practice, reserved for cakes that were particularly delicate or for special occasions when a torn cake was not acceptable. An everyday layer cake on a Wednesday evening might get grease and flour alone. A birthday cake or a Christmas cake got the paper as well. The moment of truth came when the cake came out of the oven and was allowed to cool in the pan for the prescribed 10 minutes, no longer and no less. The timing mattering because a cake turned out too soon, was still too soft to hold its shape, and a cake left too long in the pan began to steam against the metal and stick anyway. At 10 minutes, your mother ran a thin knife around the edge, the blade pressed against the side of the pan rather than the cake, breaking the seal at the rim. And then the pan went face down onto the cooling rack, and she lifted it away with both hands. When it worked, and it almost always worked if the preparation had been done correctly, the cake dropped onto the rack with a soft thud and sat there whole and even. The sides slightly golden, the top flat and ready for frosting. When it did not work, when the grease had been applied unevenly or a corner had been missed, the cake tore at that spot and left a piece of itself behind in the pan, requiring creative frosting to conceal and providing a small taste of cake batter for whoever was standing nearest the stove. That small consolation was considered adequate compensation for the imperfection, and no cake that ever came out of that kitchen went to waste because it had torn on the way out of the pan. There is something about the 1960s kitchen that trusted vinegar in ways that seem surprising now. It went into the pot roast. It went into the coleslaw. It went into the laundry. And it went into the bowl of egg whites just before they were beaten for a meringue pie. One small splash that most recipes did not mention, and most home cooks added by habit rather than by instruction. The egg whites came from eggs that had been sitting at room temperature for at least 30 minutes before they were cracked, because cold egg whites did not whip to the same volume as warm ones, the proteins too tight and contracted from the refrigerator to unfold and trap air the way they needed to. The bowl they went into was wiped first with a cut lemon or a cloth dampened with white vinegar, because any trace of fat in the bowl would prevent the whites from whipping at all. The fat molecules coating the proteins before they could link together into the foam structure that made meringue what it was. Then the whites went in, and the small splash of white vinegar went in with them, perhaps half a teaspoon for 3 or 4 whites, barely enough to smell once it was in the bowl. The beater started slow, building the first coarse bubbles, then moved to high as the foam developed, the whites going from liquid to opaque to white and glossy in the space of a few minutes, the bowl tipping as the mass inside it built and stiffened. The vinegar was doing 2 things simultaneously. Its mild acidity stabilized the foam structure, helping the protein network hold together under the heat of the oven rather than collapsing or weeping. And it interacted with the sugar that came in gradually, spoonful by spoonful, once the soft peak stage was reached, helping the sugar dissolve more completely into the whites so the finished meringue was smooth and glossy rather than grainy. The sugar went in slowly, and the waiting was important. Each spoonful needed to be incorporated fully before the next one arrived, the beater running constantly, the meringue building in volume and sheen with each addition until it stood in peaks that held their shape when the beater was lifted, the tips curling over slightly in what was called a stiff peak, but was actually something more like a graceful curve, not rigid, but firm. Onto the pie it went in generous swirls, built up high at the center and sweeping down to the edges of the crust, sealed against the filling all the way around, to prevent the dreaded weeping that happened when hot air got trapped between the meringue and the filling underneath. The back of a spoon pulled through the white surface to make the peaks that would brown in the oven, giving the finished pie its particular topography of golden tips and white valleys that was as much aesthetic as it was functional. The oven was moderate for meringue, lower than you might expect, because the goal was to set the foam and brown the peaks without overcooking the egg proteins into something rubbery or causing the sugar to caramelize unevenly. 15 minutes, sometimes 20, the kitchen filling with the smell of warm egg and sugar that was specific to a meringue pie, and to nothing else. That smell, that particular warm sweetness with its faint, eggy undertone, is one of those kitchen smells that returns memory the way few things can, vivid and immediate and attached to a specific place and a specific person. Standing at a counter with a bowl and a beater and a half teaspoon of white vinegar. The marinade your mother made could have been a dozen things. Something with vinegar and brown sugar. Something with mustard and a little oil. Something she had been making since her own mother taught her, written nowhere, measured by feel. But before the meat went into it, there was a step that happened first. A series of shallow cuts made across the surface with a sharp knife, close together, deep enough to open the grain without cutting through. And that step was the reason the flavor went all the way in, rather than just sitting on top. A piece of meat is largely impermeable from the outside. Its surface, even when it looks porous, resists liquid penetration to a surprising degree. A marinade left on an unscored surface flavors the outer few millimeters and no further, which is why a marinated steak that has not been scored can taste unremarkable in the center and complex only at the edge. The shallow cuts changed that. They created pathways into the interior, channels along which the marinade could travel deeper into the muscle, carrying with it the acid that was doing the tenderizing work and the aromatics that were doing the flavoring. The cuts went in at an angle, not straight down, but diagonal to the surface, crossing each other in a pattern that looked deliberate without requiring precision. A sharp knife was essential because a dull one tore the surface rather than cutting cleanly, compressing the muscle fibers at the edge of each cut rather than opening them. The cuts went no deeper than about a 1/4 inch, enough to breach the surface and open the grain, without going so deep that the meat began to fall apart during cooking or lose its structural integrity in the pan. Then the meat went into the marinade, the scored side down if the marinade was in a shallow dish, so the cuts were submerged and drawing the liquid in from below. If the meat went into a bowl or a bag, it was turned once or twice during its time in the refrigerator, each turn pressing the cuts against the liquid from a different angle, ensuring that the marinade had access to every channel that had been opened. What came out after a night in that marinade was fundamentally different from what had gone in. The surface of the meat had darkened where the acid had worked on it, the cuts still visible but softened at the edges, and the smell of the marinade had penetrated into the first layers of the flesh in a way that would survive the heat of the pan and arrive at the table as flavor rather than just surface coating. When the meat was cut at the table, the seasoning carried all the way through rather than existing only at the crust, and that difference was the difference between a marinade that worked and one that merely touched. This technique asked nothing of the cook except a sharp knife and a minute of attention, and it repaid that attention in every bite of the finished dish. Like most of the best things that came out of those kitchens, it was not complicated. It was just considered, in the way that cooking was considered, when the ingredients available were limited and the result needed to make up the difference. The roast came out of the oven and the table was set and everyone was ready. But your mother was not in a hurry. She set the pan on the stovetop, laid a clean dish towel loosely over the top of the meat, and left it there for a quiet stretch of time while she made the gravy and checked the rolls and refilled someone's glass. This was not a delay. This was part of the cooking, and the difference between a roast that was rested and one that was cut too soon was something you could taste and feel in every bite. When meat cooks, the muscle fibers contract from the heat and push the moisture they contain toward the center of the cut, away from the hot exterior and toward the cooler core. If you cut the meat immediately after it comes out of the oven, that moisture, still under pressure from the contracted fibers, runs out of the cut surfaces and onto the cutting board in a small flood, leaving the meat drier than it would otherwise have been. The juices that pool on the board are not surplus. They are the flavor and the tenderness of the roast. And once they are on the board, they are not going back into the meat. Resting allows the fibers to relax. As the interior temperature of the roast equalizes and the exterior begins to cool slightly, the muscle proteins loosen their grip on the moisture they have been holding, and the liquid redistributes more evenly throughout the cut. A roast that has rested for 15 or 20 minutes under a loose cloth, the cloth trapping enough heat to keep the meat warm without steaming it, will hold most of its moisture when it is cut, producing slices that are juicy from edge to center rather than dry at the outside and wet only at the core. The dish towel was the tool of choice rather than foil, because foil sealed the surface of the meat and caused it to steam, softening the crust that had formed during the last minutes of high-heat roasting. The cloth allowed enough air circulation to keep the exterior crisp while the interior settled, preserving both the texture and the temperature without interfering with either. During the resting time, the kitchen had a particular quality. The work of the main dish was done, and the supplementary work, the gravy, the vegetables, the rolls coming out of the second oven rack, occupied the hands without demanding full attention. There was a feeling of completion in the air, the hard part finished, the reward close. The smell of the rested roast, warm and slightly sweet as the fats continued their slow movement through the meat, mingled with the gravy coming together in the pan and the rolls going golden at the edges. And that combination of smells was the smell of Sunday in a 1960s house, in a way that nothing else quite was. When the cutting finally happened, the knife going through the rested meat with a steadiness that an unrested roast would not have permitted, the slices holding together rather than falling apart, the interior showing that even blush of doneness from edge to edge, it was a small vindication of the patience. A roast treated this way fed the table with something that tasted like care, because it was care, applied in the form of 15 quiet minutes and a clean dish towel. 1960s baking called for buttermilk in ways that could stop a recipe cold if you did not have any. And a trip back to the grocery store in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon was not always practical. What your mother did instead took about 10 minutes and produced something that worked in any recipe calling for the real thing, made from 2 ingredients that were almost certainly already on the counter. A cup of whole milk went into a measuring cup, and a tablespoon of white vinegar or fresh lemon juice went in with it. The acid was stirred in briefly, just enough to combine, and then the mixture was left alone on the counter for 10 minutes. During those 10 minutes, something quiet and chemical happened inside the cup. The acid caused the proteins in the milk to begin to curdle slightly, not into thick curds, but into the small, soft lumps that gave buttermilk its characteristic, slightly thickened texture. And the flavor shifted from sweet, fresh milk to something tangy and faintly sour in a way that was close enough to true buttermilk to perform all the same functions in a batter or a dough. The function buttermilk served in baking was chemical as much as it was flavoring. When buttermilk met baking soda in a batter, the acid in the buttermilk reacted with the alkaline soda to produce carbon dioxide bubbles, which were what made the batter rise. A batter made with sweet milk and baking powder alone rose differently, less quickly, with a slightly different texture and a flavor that was missing the faint tang that buttermilk contributed. The substitute worked because it contained the same mild acid, delivered in approximately the same concentration, and the baking soda in the recipe could not tell the difference. Pancakes made with this substitute had the same slight chew and tender crumb as those made with store-bought buttermilk, the edges setting in the pan with that characteristic lacy quality, the surface bubbling before the flip in the same pattern, the finished pancake pulling apart along the grain in soft layers when you pressed it with a fork. Biscuits made with it rose with the same open crumb. Cakes made with it had the same fine, moist texture. The substitute was not identical to real buttermilk, which is a byproduct of churning butter and has a complexity that the simple acid and milk version does not fully replicate. But for the purpose of baking, for the chemical interaction it needed to perform, it was entirely sufficient. The lemon juice version had a faint citrus quality that could be detected in very delicate recipes and was considered preferable in cakes where that note was welcome. The vinegar version was more neutral and was generally the choice for savory baking, biscuits and cornbread, and savory scones, where a citrus note would have been intrusive. Both were kept on the counter, the lemons in the fruit bowl and the white vinegar in the cabinet alongside the baking soda, and the knowledge of which to use for which purpose was the kind of practical baking knowledge that lived in the hands of every capable home cook in that era without having been formally taught. The roll of wax paper that sat in the second drawer down was one of the hardest working things in the kitchen, and it had been there long before plastic wrap arrived and long before anyone thought to question it. It went down on the counter before rolling out dough. It wrapped the sandwiches in the lunch boxes. It lined the bottom of the cake pan after flouring. It covered the bowl of rising bread. It sat between the layers of cookies so they did not stick together in the tin. Rolling out pie dough on wax paper changed the whole exercise. The dough went between two sheets, one below and one above, the rolling pin working over the top sheet while the dough spread between them without sticking to the counter and without requiring additional flour that could tighten the dough and toughen the finished crust. When the dough was rolled to the right thickness, the top sheet came away and the bottom sheet was used to lift and transfer the dough to the pie dish, peeled away once the dough was in place, a delivery method that preserved the shape of the circle and prevented the tearing that came from trying to lift raw pastry with bare hands. The lunchbox sandwiches wrapped in wax paper had a particular quality when they were unwrapped at noon. The paper unfolding in that specific way wax paper unfolds, resistant and slightly crinkly, releasing a faint waxy smell that was itself a part of the lunch experience in a way that plastic bags never replicated. The bread inside was not compressed or sweated, because wax paper breathed slightly in a way that plastic did not. And a sandwich wrapped in wax paper at 7 in the morning was still recognizably itself at noon, the bread holding its texture, the filling contained. Wax paper went over the bowl of bread dough during the first rise, held down at the edges by the weight of a dish towel laid on top. It created a slightly humid environment above the dough without sealing it completely, allowing the carbon dioxide produced by the yeast to escape while keeping the surface of the dough from drying out and forming a skin that would interfere with the rise. It was not as effective as the damp cloth for long rises or in dry kitchens, but for a standard rise in a warm kitchen, it worked adequately and it was convenient. The roll always close at hand, the paper torn off in the right length in a single practiced motion. Between cookie layers in the tin, it served a simple purpose that required no explanation. Cookies stacked directly on top of each other stuck together, the soft ones deforming under the weight of the ones above, the decorated ones losing their surfaces. A sheet of wax paper between each layer kept them separate and intact. And when the tin was opened 3 days after baking, the cookies were still individual, still whole, still the shape they had been when they came off the cooling rack. Plastic wrap, when it arrived, did some of these things better and some of them worse, and it introduced a sealing capability that wax paper could not match. But wax paper remained in that drawer for years after plastic wrap arrived, because it continued to do certain jobs better, particularly the jobs that required a surface the dough would not stick to and that the rolling pin could work over. Some things were not improved by the newer technology. They were just replaced by it, which is a slightly different thing. The bunch of parsley, or the stems of fresh mint that came home from the market on Saturday, did not go into the refrigerator in a plastic bag and collapse by Tuesday. In a 1960s kitchen, they went into a glass of cold water on the counter, treated the same way you might treat a handful of wildflowers, and they lasted through most of the week with their color and their smell largely intact. It was a small thing, barely a trick at all, but it was the kind of small thing that made a kitchen run smoothly. The stems went into the glass cut end down, the water coming up about an inch, enough to cover the ends, but not so much that the lower leaves were submerged and would begin to rot. The glass went onto the counter near the window if there was one, or onto the shelf above the sink, somewhere with a little light, but not direct sun that would warm the water and accelerate decay. A loose covering of a plastic bag or a damp paper towel over the top of the herbs kept the moisture in around the leaves without suffocating them. And in that configuration, a bunch of parsley that might have gone yellow and limp by Wednesday stayed green and fragrant through Friday or Saturday. Parsley was the most common herb kept this way. It went into almost everything, scattered over the top of finished dishes as much for color as for flavor. Chopped, fine in potato salad, stirred into the compound butter that went onto the bread at Sunday dinner. Mint went this way in summer, kept for the iced tea that was made in the tall pitcher every morning and for the occasional dessert that needed a sprig on top. Cilantro kept this way lasted considerably longer than it did in any other storage method, which mattered because cilantro was a late arrival to many of these kitchens, but when it appeared it was used enthusiastically. The act of reaching for the glass on the counter, rather than hunting through the refrigerator for a bag of browning herbs, was itself a small pleasure. The kind of small pleasure that a well-organized kitchen produced regularly, without requiring any particular effort. The herbs were visible. They were present. They reminded you of what was available and suggested what could be made with them in a way that a sealed bag in a vegetable drawer did not. A bunch of parsley standing in a glass on the counter was an invitation. A bunch of parsley collapsed in a plastic bag was an obligation. The water in the glass was changed every couple of days, fresh cold water replacing the slightly cloudy water that the stems had been drawing from. The cut ends trimmed a fraction with the kitchen scissors to open new surface for uptake. This took perhaps 30 seconds and extended the useful life of the herbs by another several days, and the scissors that did it were the same scissors that cut the twine off the Sunday roast and snipped the chives over the baked potato and trimmed the crusts off sandwiches for the children. In a kitchen where every tool had multiple uses and nothing was idle when it could be working, even the scissors had a relationship with the herbs in the glass on the counter. The pot of water had to be rolling before the pasta went in, and before the pasta went in, the salt went in. Not a careful pinch, but a real amount, the kind that made the water taste faintly of the sea. This was not negotiable in a 1960s kitchen that knew what it was doing. The salt was not there just for flavor, though it gave flavor. It changed the way the pasta cooked, the texture it had when it came out, the way the sauce clung to it, later. Salted water boils at a fractionally higher temperature than unsalted water, a difference small enough to be practically irrelevant to cooking time but meaningful in terms of the environment the pasta cooked in. More significantly, the salt in the water seasoned the pasta from the outside in as it cooked, the sodium penetrating the surface of the dough and becoming part of the structure of the finished pasta, rather than being applied to the outside afterward. Pasta cooked in unsalted water and then salted after plating tastes seasoned on the surface. Pasta cooked in properly salted water tastes seasoned all the way through, a difference that is immediately apparent to anyone who has tasted both. The salt also affected the texture. In well-salted water, pasta cooked to a slightly firmer finish at the same cooking time, the surface proteins setting at a pace that maintained the integrity of the strand or the shape, keeping it from going soft and sticky in the way that pasta cooked in flat water tended to. This was the pasta that held its shape under sauce, that still had something to give back against the fork rather than yielding without resistance, that carried a mouthful of tomato sauce or butter or browned garlic without becoming merely a vehicle for what was on top of it. In 1962, pasta in most American homes meant spaghetti or elbow macaroni, and it came from a box on the pantry shelf. The cooking of it was not considered sophisticated, but it was considered important. The water salted generously before it reached a boil. The pasta stirred immediately on entry to prevent sticking. The timing watched with some care, because overcooked pasta was a failure that could not be corrected, and undercooked pasta could be given another minute if caught in time. The test was the same one used in every kitchen that produced good pasta. A strand lifted from the water and bitten in two. The cross-section examined for the thin white line at the center that meant it needed a minute more, or the uniform color that meant it was ready. The pasta water that remained in the pot after the pasta came out was not always poured away. A cup of it, cloudy with starch, was kept back and added to the sauce as it came together in the pan, the starchy water loosening the sauce to the right consistency while simultaneously helping it adhere to the pasta in a way that plain water could not. This was not a sophisticated restaurant technique that filtered down into home kitchens. It was a practical solution to a practical problem observed by home cooks who noticed that a little of the cooking water made the sauce work better and kept the practice because it was true. Somewhere on the shelf of almost every refrigerator in 1963, there was a small open dish or a torn open box of baking soda sitting quietly at the back, not doing anything you could see, just being present the way certain useful things are present before you know you need them. It was not for baking. It was not waiting to be measured into a recipe. It was there to absorb the smell of last night's fish and the leftover onion and whatever had been in the crisper too long. And it worked in a way that was as simple and as reliable as anything else in that kitchen. Baking soda is sodium bicarbonate, mildly alkaline, and the odors that accumulate in a refrigerator tend to be acidic compounds. The volatile fatty acids from meat and fish, the sulfur compounds from onions and cabbage, the organic acids from fruits that have begun to turn. An alkaline substance placed in the enclosed space of a refrigerator neutralizes some of those acidic compounds on contact, converting them into less volatile forms that do not carry their smell as readily. The open dish presented as much surface area as possible to the air circulating inside the refrigerator, maximizing the contact between the baking soda and the odor molecules drifting through that space. The dish was replaced every month or so, the old baking soda tipped down the drain or put to work cleaning the sink, and a fresh portion set out in its place. Some kitchens used the box itself, the top folded back, or a section of the side torn away to expose the contents directly to the air. The box small enough to fit on the shelf without taking space needed for food. The same box served two purposes at the end of its refrigerator life. The final portion went into the drain with a splash of vinegar to clean the pipes, a small eruption of foam in the drain that was satisfying in the way that all small chemical reactions are satisfying when they produce exactly the result expected. The refrigerator in 1963 was a different machine from the one in most kitchens today. It was smaller, it ran warmer, and it was opened more often because the kitchen relied on it more continuously through the day than modern kitchens tend to. More opening meant more odor exchange between the food inside and the air outside, and more varied food stored in close proximity meant more opportunity for smells to travel between containers. The baking soda addressed a real and daily problem rather than a theoretical one. What is worth noticing about this practice is how perfectly it fit the ethic of that kitchen. Nothing purchased specifically for this purpose. Nothing that needed replacing expensively or regularly. A small amount of an ingredient already present for baking, given a second job in a different part of the kitchen, doing its quiet work for a month before being retired into a third job cleaning the drain, a single substance earning its place 3 times over before it left the house. That was how that kitchen thought about everything it brought through the door. Not every kitchen in the early 1960s was frying tofu, but every one of them was frying something, and the principle was the same no matter what went into the pan. Moisture was the enemy. It was the thing that made the oil spit and the surface steam instead of sear, that kept the outside from going golden and left things soft when they should have been crisp. Your mother knew this the way she knew most things in that kitchen, not from a book, but from the result. Eggplant was the most common vegetable to receive this treatment in those kitchens. Sliced and laid out on a clean dish towel or between layers of paper towel, the slices were pressed firmly with the flat of a hand or weighted down with a heavy pot for 20 minutes before they went near the pan. The liquid that came out of them in that time was considerable, pooling in the towel or darkening the paper, and what remained was a denser, drier slice that absorbed far less oil during frying, crisped more readily on the outside, and cooked through more evenly because the heat was not fighting against the moisture escaping from inside. Zucchini went through the same process, and summer squash, and the mushrooms that were going into a stuffing or a sauce, where liquid in the pan would dilute the flavor and prevent the browning that gave them their depth. Mushrooms pressed between towels and then cooked in a very hot pan, with very little fat, went golden and slightly chewy in a way that mushrooms added directly from the bag never managed. The moisture that came out of them immediately in a hot pan, turning to steam and preventing the contact with the metal surface that made browning possible. The pressing was not complicated, and it required no equipment beyond what was already in the kitchen. The dish towel that had been drying dishes all morning was perfectly suited. The cast iron pan that provided the weight was sitting on the stove. The principle that guided the action was simple. Water in the food and hot oil in the pan produced spatter, steam, and softness where crispness was wanted, and the solution was to remove the water before the food went anywhere near the heat. This understanding shaped how everything was prepared before it went into the pan. Chicken pieces patted dry with paper towel before flouring. Fish fillets pressed between clean cloths before the egg wash. Pork chops dried at the surface with a dish towel before they went into the hot cast iron. The drying was a quiet, automatic step that happened between the preparation and the cooking without ceremony, part of the invisible competence of that kitchen, the kind of step that went unnoticed when it was done and was only apparent in its absence. When something went into a wet pan and the kitchen filled with steam instead of the sound of a proper sear. The cake that had been on the counter since Sunday was not going to be thrown away on Wednesday just because it had dried a little at the edges. In a 1960s kitchen, a dry cake was not a problem. It was a starting point. Cubed and layered in a bowl with custard and fruit and a little whipped cream, it became something else entirely. Something that had its own name and its own occasion and required almost no additional work. The dessert this produced went by different names in different households. Trifle in kitchens that held on to older English traditions. Icebox cake in those that had adapted the technique to local ingredients and local taste. Some version of a layered fruit pudding in kitchens where no name had been formally assigned, but where everyone at the table understood what it was and looked forward to it specifically. Whatever the name, the structure was the same. Cake on the bottom, in cubes or in crumbles, softened by a spoonful of fruit juice or sherry, or simply by the moisture of the custard laid over the top. Then fruit, whatever was in the bowl or in the can, peaches or cherries or the last of the summer strawberries preserved in sugar. Then the custard, warm when it was made and cooled to room temperature before it went into the bowl so it would not melt the whipped cream that followed. Then the cream, whipped stiff and spooned over the top in irregular mounds, with perhaps a few of the fruit pieces arranged on the surface for the appearance of intention. This assembled thing went into the refrigerator for several hours, ideally overnight, and during that time something happened to it that was better than the sum of its parts. The cake absorbed the custard from below and the cream from above, and became something that was no longer dry or crumbly, but soft and dense and deeply flavored, carrying both the flavor of the original cake and the flavors of everything that had been layered around it. The fruit had released its juice into the custard. The cream had loosened slightly and merged with the top layer of custard into something that was neither one thing nor the other, but better than both. The whole bowl had become unified in a way that the individual components were not. This was economy expressed as hospitality. A 3-day-old cake that would have been stale and uninviting, served plain, was transformed into a dessert that felt generous and considered, something that seemed to have been planned rather than assembled from what was available. The guests who ate it at Wednesday's dinner did not need to know that the cake had been baked on Sunday. They tasted only what was in front of them, which was something layered and cool and complex, something that tasted like it had been meant for them. That quality, the ability to transform what remained into something that felt intentional and new, was one of the defining capabilities of a kitchen that wasted nothing. It was not frugality in any self-conscious sense. It was creativity applied to the problem of the leftover, the answer always found somewhere in the combination of what was already there. It is quiet now in the kitchen. The dishes are done, and the dish towel is folded back over the handle. Whatever was cooking this afternoon has settled into the house the way good smells do, soft and slow, clinging to the curtains and the wooden chairs. And somewhere on the shelf above the counter, between a book on canning and a church ladies' collection from 1958, there is a cookbook with handwriting in the margins. Not the printed recipe, the real one. The one that says add a little more of this, skip that entirely. And Grandma always used twice as much butter as it calls for. The cookbook itself might have been a gift, or a purchase, or something handed down. Its spine cracked from use. The pages at the most used sections falling open without being asked, because the binding had learned the habits of the kitchen over years. The printed recipe was a starting point. It was what the cookbook's author had decided was correct in their kitchen, with their stove, in their region, using the ingredients available to them. The marginal notes were what the cook in this kitchen had decided was actually correct, adjusted for her particular stove that ran slightly hot on the left side, for the vanilla she preferred which was stronger than most, for the fact that the original recipe used salted butter, and she always had unsalted, and the difference mattered. Some margins were dense with notes. A recipe for white cake might have 3 or 4 amendments in different inks suggesting different moments of revision over different years. One note in pencil from an early use that said too sweet. Another in blue ink from later that said add sour cream for texture. A third in the precise handwriting of an older hand that said this is the one, meaning the version that had finally arrived at the right place after years of small corrections. That final note was the recipe, not the printed version below it, and the woman who had written it knew that without needing to write it down anywhere formally. The church ladies' collection was a different kind of document. Not a commercial cookbook, but a spiral-bound collection of contributed recipes, each one attributed to the woman who had submitted it. The name's a social record of a particular community in a particular decade. Mrs. Patterson's divinity, Mrs. Kowalski's stuffed cabbage. The chocolate sheet cake attributed to 3 different women who had each submitted a version. All slightly different, the variations suggesting that the recipe had traveled through that congregation in stages, each woman adjusting it to her kitchen and her taste before passing it on to the next. Those books are artifacts now. The ones that survive in attics and the back shelves of antique stores carry the physical record of how food actually moved through communities, not through the printed recipe, but through the handwritten amendment, The stain on the page that is the record of an ingredient added too quickly. The dog-eared corner that marks the recipe cooked so often the page had been turned to it 100 times and remembered the position. The woman who wrote in those margins did not think she was preserving anything. She was simply correcting the record, setting down what actually worked so she would not have to remember it the next time. But what she was preserving, without knowing it, was the specific intelligence of her particular kitchen, the accumulated knowledge of years of cooking in one place with one stove and one family's worth of preferences, written in the only place available, which happened to be the margins of someone else's idea of how the thing should be done. That is where the real recipes lived, not in the printed text, but in the space around it, in the handwriting that said, no, actually, do it this way, in the tradition of correction and amendment and improvement that passed from one generation to the next, not through formal instruction, but through a borrowed book and a pencil, and the quiet authority of someone who had made this dish enough times to know exactly where the original had it wrong. It is late Thursday afternoon now, and the grocery run is not until Saturday, and the refrigerator has that particular late-week quality where the obvious ingredients are gone, and what remains requires a little thought. In a 1960s kitchen, this was not a crisis. It was Thursday, and Thursday had its own kind of cooking, the kind that did not follow a recipe, because the recipe would have called for something that was not there, and what came out of it was often better than what a recipe would have produced anyway. The pantry in that kitchen was a specific geography, a shelf of canned goods, tomatoes and corn, and green beans and peaches, arranged with the newest purchases at the back and the oldest at the front. A row of dried goods in glass jars, the rice, and the split peas, and the lentils, and the dried beans already discussed. And beside them, the flour and the cornmeal and the oats, a bottle of oil and one of vinegar, the spice shelf with its row of small tins, whatever was left of the week's bread, and the refrigerator beside it, holding the odds and ends of meals already made, the half onion wrapped in paper, the end of the cheese, the last 2 eggs. From these things, dinner was made, not by following a plan, but by reading what was available the way a musician reads a room, understanding what was there and what it could become if combined with the right things in the right order. A can of tomatoes and the half onion and the dried herbs on the spice shelf and a handful of rice became a soup that took 30 minutes and tasted as though it had been planned from the start. The end of the cheese grated over the top of something it had no business being on top of made that something better and used the cheese before it dried out completely. The last 2 eggs went into a skillet with whatever vegetables were at the edge of their usefulness and became something deeply satisfying, the eggs binding everything together into a cohesive dish that felt intentional rather than assembled from what was left. This kind of cooking required a specific confidence, the confidence of someone who understood flavor combinations well enough to improvise, who knew that acid brightened a dish that tasted flat, that fat carried flavor into every component it touched, that salt applied in layers throughout the cooking produced a different result than salt applied only at the end. Those principles, internalized through years of daily cooking, were what made Thursday dinner possible without a recipe and without a full pantry. They were not written down anywhere. They lived in the hands and the instincts of a cook who had stood at this stove long enough to understand what it could do. The half onion that had been in the refrigerator since Monday was the beginning of something. Sliced thin and cooked low in a little of the bacon grease until it went soft and sweet and slightly golden, it became a foundation for almost anything. The can of tomatoes that went in next brought acid and body. A pinch of the dried oregano from the tin on the spice shelf brought the memory of summer into a Thursday evening in November. A handful of the rice that had been in the jar for 2 weeks came in last, and absorbed the liquid and the flavor of everything around it. And what sat on the stove 25 minutes later was a dish that smelled generous and tasted considered. The children who grew up eating Thursday dinners in those kitchens did not always know they were eating improvisation. They tasted the result, which was warm and filling, and flavored with the particular combination of things their mother had reached for that evening, and they associated it with home and comfort in a way that had nothing to do with the circumstances of its creation. Some of those children grew up and tried to recreate those Thursday meals and found they could not, because there was no recipe to follow, only a set of instincts that had not been fully transmitted in the watching. The transmission had been partial, the knowledge living in the person who made it rather than in any document. The modern kitchen is so abundantly supplied, the grocery store so close, the delivery app so immediate, that the Thursday afternoon pantry problem rarely arises. When it does, it tends to produce anxiety rather than creativity, a sense of being without rather than a sense of possibility. But the cooks who grew up in that era, who learned to cook in kitchens where making do was a regular practice rather than an occasional inconvenience, carried a flexibility in their approach to food that was genuinely useful and that produced some of the most memorable meals those kitchens ever made. The best soup your grandmother ever made was probably not from a recipe. It was from a Thursday. And the reason it was the best was not that she had the right ingredients, but that she knew what to do with what she had. And she had done it enough times that her hands knew before her mind did, which is the definition of a cook rather than someone who follows instructions. That kind of knowledge cannot be bought or downloaded or found in a search result. It can only be built, slowly and imperfectly, through the repeated experience of standing at a stove on a Thursday afternoon and deciding, from what is there, what dinner will be. It is harder to acquire now because the conditions that produced it are rarer. But it is not gone. It shows up every time someone opens a nearly empty refrigerator and makes something good from what they find there, without panic, without a recipe, with only the quiet confidence of knowing that the pantry has enough if you know how to read it. Sunday is when it started, but Sunday was only the beginning. The chicken that went into the oven on Sunday afternoon, rubbed with butter and seasoned simply with salt and pepper and perhaps a little dried thyme from the tin on the spice shelf, was not just Sunday dinner. It was the architecture of the week ahead, and your mother understood that before she ever turned on the oven. The chicken roasted in a low pan on a bed of roughly cut onion and celery, the vegetables not destined for the table, but for the flavor they would give to the drippings and eventually to the stock. It roasted at a moderate heat for the better part of 2 hours, the skin going golden and then deeper, the fat rendering out and basting the breast as it ran down, the kitchen filling with the smell that more than any other smell said Sunday in a house where this was the weekly ritual. That smell reached every room. It came under the door of the bedroom where someone was napping, and into the living room where the radio was on low, and into the back hallway where the coats hung. It announced dinner the way nothing else in that kitchen announced it, with authority and warmth, and an unhurried certainty that the table would be worth coming to. At the table, it was carved by whoever did the carving. The breast slices arranged on the platter, the thighs and drumsticks separated at the joint. Everything laid out with the simple abundance of a roasted bird that had been given the time it needed in the oven. The first meal was the best, the meat at its juiciest, the skin still crisp, the pan juices spooned over everything, bread on the side to catch what ran off the meat and onto the plate. What happened after was the real story. Monday, the carcass went into the stock pot with the vegetables from the roasting pan and whatever else was needed, the slow simmer extracting everything the bones still held. The water went in cold, and came up slowly. The surface occasionally skimmed of the foam that rose in the first 30 minutes, and then the whole pot was left at the barest simmer, the surface trembling rather than boiling, for the better part of the morning. By Monday afternoon there was stock, golden and clear and rich, and that stock became the base for Tuesday's soup, which used the shredded meat picked from the carcass on Sunday evening, the dark meat especially, pulled into pieces and stored in a bowl in the refrigerator waiting for its second appearance. The soup on Tuesday was different from Sunday's dinner, but made from the same animal, a continuity of flavor that ran through the week's meals in a way that felt generous, even when the household budget was careful. Wednesday, the last of the picked meat went into a casserole, bound with a little of the remaining stock and some vegetables from the pantry, topped with biscuit dough and baked until the top was golden and the filling underneath was bubbling at the edges. The smell of that casserole was related to Sunday's smell, but different, richer, and more concentrated, the flavor of the chicken having deepened through its 3 days of different preparations. Thursday, the stock that had not been used went into the beans, or the rice or whatever was simmering on the back burner. Friday. There might be nothing left of the chicken at all, the last shreds of it having gone into a sandwich, or into the scrambled eggs that served as a quick dinner on the last night before the Saturday shopping. The chicken had been completely used, not a useful piece of it wasted, and it had fed the family across 5 days in 5 different forms, without any single meal feeling like a repetition of the one before. This was not remarkable in any kitchen that practiced it. It was simply the way a chicken was used, the way any significant ingredient was used, extended through the week in different forms, each preparation drawing on what had come before and contributing to what would come next. The economy of it was real, but the pleasure of it was equally real, because a kitchen that used its ingredients fully produced meals that were deeply flavored in a way that kitchens which used everything once and discarded the rest could not. The bones gave what the meat had not fully given. The stock carried the flavor of the bones into dishes that had no bone in them. The week's meals were connected in a way that gave them a coherence, a sense of the kitchen as a continuous operation rather than a series of separate events. The Sunday chicken was one purchase that became 1 week of eating, and the care with which it was used from Sunday through Friday was the kind of care that made a modest budget feel abundant and made a simple animal feel like it had been properly honored. That is not a small thing. It is, in fact, the whole thing. Let's stop here for a moment, not to discuss a technique, but to talk about what the kitchen smelled like when the oven was on, because that smell was itself a kind of nourishment, and it is worth naming it properly before we move on. Bread baking smelled like warmth before warmth was a concept. It was yeasty and faintly alcoholic in the early stages, when the oven heat met the living dough and the last burst of fermentation happened before the yeast died in the heat, and then it shifted to something drier and more golden as the crust formed. A smell that had no modern equivalent and no substitute. It built slowly through the house, starting in the kitchen and moving room by room as the bake progressed, thickening in the hallway, reaching the back of the house in the second half hour. And by the time the loaf was ready, the entire house had been changed by it. If you came home on a bread day and that smell met you at the door, the day improved immediately. Whatever kind of day it had been up to that point. A cake baking smelled sweeter and more delicate, the butter and sugar and vanilla combining into something that was almost visible in its richness, that made everyone in the house find a reason to be in or near the kitchen in the last 20 minutes of baking. Children appeared in the doorway. Someone who had been in the yard came inside. A conversation that had been happening in another room migrated toward the kitchen without anyone making a conscious decision to move. The moment the oven door opened and the finished cake came out on its rack, the smell intensified and then settled into the room and stayed there for the rest of the afternoon. warm and sweet and domestic in a way that felt like safety. The specific safety of being somewhere that someone has gone to trouble for you. Cookies smelled quicker and sharper, brown sugar and butter going golden on the pan, the chocolate chips softening and releasing their particular dark sweetness, the edges crisping in the last 2 minutes before the timer. Cookie smell was briefer than bread smell or cake smell, more urgent, a smell that said something is ready right now and will be best in the next 5 minutes. It produced a different response than the long, slow smell of bread, more immediate, less contemplative, more likely to produce a small crowd around the oven with hands already reaching before the pan was fully out. Pies smelled of fruit and pastry together, the juice bubbling up through the vents in the top crust and caramelizing slightly where it ran onto the pan, the butter in the pastry going golden and flaky, the fruit inside thickening and concentrating as the heat drove off the water. Apple pie smelled like autumn, regardless of when it was baked. Cherry pie smelled bright and slightly tart, that particular deep red sweetness that was more intense than the fruit eaten raw. Peach pie smelled like the end of summer, a sweetness with a faint floral quality that the other fruit pies did not have, a smell that was nostalgic even when you were living through the moment it belonged to. These smells did something to a house that went beyond the merely pleasant. They announced presence and activity and care. They said that someone had been here, working with their hands, making something for the people who would come through the door later. They were a form of welcome extended in advance, a message sent from the kitchen to wherever in the house you happened to be, and the message was always the same. Something good is happening here. Come when you are ready. There will be enough. That is harder to find now. Not impossible, but harder. A kitchen that smells of something baking is a kitchen that someone has given time to, and time is what most kitchens are asked to save rather than spend. The convenience that replaced the baking, the packaged cake, the store-bought bread, the boxed cookie mix that still requires an oven but produces a smell that is thinner and briefer and less thoroughly itself, was purchased partly at the cost of that smell, which is to say at the cost of everything that smell communicated. What gets lost in the saving of time is not just the smell, but the quality of arrival it produced, the specific feeling of coming home to a house that had been warm and occupied and productive in your absence, the smell of it meeting you before anything else did, before the coat was off, before a word was spoken. That feeling was given by the oven and by the person who turned it on and stayed near it. And it is one of the things most worth recovering, even imperfectly, even occasionally, because its effect on a house and on the people in it is entirely disproportionate to the effort required to produce it. It is August now, and the kitchen is at its busiest and its hottest, and the work being done in it is not for tonight or for this week, but for January, when the garden is frozen and the tomatoes in the grocery store are pale and watery, and the jar on the pantry shelf that was put up in August is the only thing that tastes like summer anymore. Canning in a 1960s household was a seasonal project that took over the kitchen for days at a time. The large pot, the biggest in the house, came out from wherever it was stored and went on the stove. The mason jars came out of the cabinet and were inspected for chips at the rim. The lids and bands sorted, and the old ones set aside for replacement. The good ones washed and set out in a row on the clean dish towel that covered the counter. The tomatoes, or the peaches, or the green beans, or the corn cut from the cob in a sweet summer morning rush, went through the kitchen in volume, processed and packed and sealed in a rhythm that was repetitive and physical and deeply satisfying in the way that work with a clear beginning and a clear end is satisfying. The satisfaction of a project that would be measurable and visible on the pantry shelf when it was done. The smell of canning day was specific and unreproducible. Hot vinegar for the pickles, sweet and sharp and eye-watering. The cucumbers going in raw and coming out preserved in a brine that smelled like summer and salt and dill in equal parts. Hot sugar syrup for the peaches. The halved fruit arranged in the jars with a care that was partly practical and partly aesthetic. The golden flesh curved against the glass. The syrup poured over to within half an inch of the rim. Hot tomatoes going through the food mill in a red, fragrant stream. The skins and seeds left behind. The pure tomato pulp going into the wide-mouthed jars that would become the base of every winter pasta sauce and every cold-weather soup from October through March. The sealed jars went into the water bath for their processing time. The pot at a full boil. The steam rising in the kitchen that was already hot from August. The windows open but offering little relief. A fan in the doorway moving the hot air without cooling it. The work continuing because the work had to be done while the produce was right. While the tomatoes were at their peak and the peaches were fully ripe and the beans were still tender and had not gone tough in the summer heat. The season did not wait, and the kitchen did not wait either. You worked in the heat because the heat was when the food was ready, and the food being ready was the whole point. When the jars came out of the water bath and were set on the counter, too cool, the sound of the lids sealing one by one was one of the most satisfying sounds that kitchen ever produced. A small metallic click as the vacuum formed under each lid. The center of the lid pulling down and going concave. Confirmation that the jar had sealed correctly and would hold. Your mother counted them, ran her finger across the top of each lid checking for the seal, noted any that had not gone down, and set those aside for immediate use, and lined the sealed jars on the pantry shelf where they would sit in their row, labeled in pencil on a strip of masking tape with the contents and the month and the year. That row of jars was a particular kind of wealth, visible and specific and earned through an August afternoon's work in a hot kitchen. It did not look like wealth because the jars were plain and the labels were handwritten and the pantry shelf was ordinary. But when December came, and the fresh produce in the grocery store was expensive and limited, and nothing tasted the way it tasted in summer, that shelf was something to draw from that most households today do not have an equivalent of. The jar of tomatoes that came down in January and went into the pan released a smell when it opened that was unmistakably August, the concentrated sweetness of a tomato picked at the height of its season, and that smell in a January kitchen was a specific gift to the person who had thought to put it up 6 months earlier. That is what canning was. It was time travel, summer sent forward into winter, the best of one season preserved and made available in the worst of another, the work of August feeding the cold of January. A kitchen organized around that kind of foresight was a kitchen that was always in some quiet and practical way ahead of the season, drawing on what had been done rather than only on what was immediately available, and the comfort that produced was real and warm and worth every hour spent in a hot kitchen in August putting it there. And so, the kitchen goes quiet. The percolator has given its last cup. The dish towel is folded back over the handle the way it always is, the way it has been in this kitchen for as long as anyone can remember. The skillet is cooling on the back of the stove. The jar of bacon grease is in its corner. The mason jars on the pantry shelf are holding their summer in the dark, patient and sealed, waiting for January to make them necessary. You have been here for a while now, walking through a kitchen that most of the world has forgotten, or is in the process of forgetting, the way things get forgotten when they are replaced by something faster and louder and more convenient. But you were here, and you paid attention, And that means something. It means that somewhere in the back of your mind, in the place where certain smells and textures and sounds live long after the moment that produced them has passed, this kitchen is a little more real than it was an hour ago. Think about what you heard tonight. The bacon grease settling into the tin with that soft pour. The lid of the mason jar clicking down as the vacuum sealed. The sound of the stool swiveling at the lunch counter. The particular weight of the ceramic cup on the formica surface. The griddle behind the counter going quiet for a moment before the next order came in. The bread coming out of the oven wrapped in its damp cloth. The steam releasing at the edges when your mother peeled it back. The roast resting under the dish towel. The kitchen holding that particular Sunday smell of something finished and something beginning. These are not small things. They are the texture of a life lived close to the ground, close to the actual work of feeding people, close to the daily intelligence of a kitchen that wasted nothing and produced everything it needed from what it had. That intelligence did not announce itself. It did not ask to be admired. It simply worked, day after day, Tuesday after Tuesday, in kitchens across this country where someone got up before the family and put the coffee on and started the day the way the day needed to be started. There is a version of this that you can bring back. Not the whole of it, not all at once, and not in a way that demands anything dramatic from your life as it is now. But some of it, a bone kept for the stock, an overnight soak for the beans, a pan deglazed after the meat comes out, the drippings turned into gravy in the same 4 minutes your mother used, a dish towel over the resting roast, a glass of cold water beside the pot of sugar on the stove, a piece of bread laid on top of the brown sugar before the lid goes back on, a bunch of parsley standing in a glass of water on the counter, green and fragrant, lasting the whole week because someone put it in water instead of a bag. These things cost almost nothing. They ask very little. And they give back something that is genuinely difficult to name. Something that has to do with the relationship between a person and their kitchen. The feeling of a kitchen that is being used well rather than merely serviced. That is producing something true rather than just convenient. The people who cook this way are mostly gone now. The women who kept those kitchens, who knew the softball stage by feel and the right moment to pull the pan by the color of the sugar and the exact amount of salt in the pasta water by the taste of the water itself, who wrote in the margins of the cookbook because the printed recipe was only the beginning of what they knew. Those women carried their knowledge in their hands and in their habits, and they passed on what they could to whoever was standing close enough to watch. Some of it was caught and is still being practiced in kitchens today. Some of it was lost in the gap between the generation that knew it and the generation that was handed a microwave and told the dinner could be ready in 4 minutes. But knowledge that has been practiced long enough leaves a kind of residue. It stays in the objects, in the cast iron skillet that is still black and smooth from decades of use. It stays in the cookbooks with the handwritten margins, the ones that sit in attics and antique stores with their dog-eared pages and their stained covers and their small crowded notes in pencil and blue ink. It stays in the recipes that were never written down at all, the ones that live only in the memory of whoever watched them being made and have to be reconstructed from that memory, imperfectly and lovingly, in a kitchen that is trying to get back to something true. It stays in you, if you let it, in the willingness to soak something overnight, to save something that could be used again, to sit with the last cup of coffee in a clean kitchen at the end of a day and feel for a moment the particular satisfaction of a space that has done its work and done it well. That is the kitchen this whole journey has been about. Not a museum piece and not a fantasy. A real kitchen, in a real house, on a real Tuesday. where someone was paying attention and using what they had and feeding people in the most honest way available to them. A kitchen that smelled like bread on bread day and like Sunday on Sunday and like bacon every single morning. A kitchen that kept its bacon grease and its soup bones and its dried beans in glass jars and its last cup of coffee warm on the back of the stove. A kitchen worth remembering and worth returning to even now, even in whatever kitchen you have, with whatever you have in it tonight. Before you go, if this journey meant something to you, if it brought back a smell or a memory or a feeling you had not thought about in a while, please take a moment to leave a comment below. Tell me where you are watching from. Tell me what kitchen came to mind when you were listening. Tell me about the woman who kept the bacon grease can, or the man who rested the roast under the dish towel, or the grandmother who wrote in the margins of her cookbook in handwriting you still recognize. Those stories belong here. This community is built from them. If you are not yet subscribed, now is a good time. There are more kitchens to visit, more mornings to walk through, more ordinary days in American life that deserve to be remembered slowly and well. And if you prefer to listen, we are on Spotify now. The link is in the description, and the voice will be there whenever you need it, whether that is in the car, or on a walk, or late at night when the house is quiet and you want something warm to fall asleep to. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for sitting with it. The coffee is still warm. The kitchen is still there. And the day, as it always does, is just beginning somewhere.